Hi, I'm Tim Maloney, and this is my STEM talk for Alter High School in fall 2020. Let's share the screen, go to my slides. Okay, go to slideshow, and here I am. I'm going to talk about physics, mathematics, electrical engineering, and my job in the semiconductor industry. Let's get on to an introduction. I came from Alter's class of 1967, the second graduating class. That year, our valedictorian was David Bradley, who was a developer of the IBM personal computer after he graduated with his PhD from Purdue. And he is what IBM calls the inventor of Control-Alt-Delete in 1979. Well, I can't top that, but I do have an example from everyday computer use myself that I can talk about later. Dave was a great guy to have around, as were a few of my classmates who got together to challenge each other on all kinds of scientific topics and puzzles and ideas. I'd say we enhanced our educational experience at Alter through these interactions. And during our senior year at Alter, there was one classroom of us taking chemistry. Chemistry was taught to seniors that year and the year before because the chemistry lab in our new high school wasn't ready until then. But we had one room of us taking a new curricula taught by Carol Shaw, selected and taught by Carol Shaw, later of UD Chemical Engineering Department. I would call this a problem-solving approach to chemistry, now familiar, but that I found appealed to me quite a bit and turned out to be what I'd say is the most MIT-like course that I took at Alter. I'll have more to say about MIT in a moment. It took many years and years later, I found out that this chem study curricula pioneered in the 60s was largely developed at University of California, Berkeley, and also some of it tried out at a high school in Palo Alto, right near where I live now in Silicon Valley. So in one way, you can see the first 10 years out of high school were all coming back to where my favorite Alter course was developed here in California. Interesting how those connections work out. More generally today, I'd like to tell you about my career as what I call a 40-year window in history, is typical of a lot of people. But you know, my 40-year window has to do with when I was born, when I graduated from high school, and so on. And it will for you too. Yours will be quite a bit different, but mine and others are of interest because we know it's useful to study history. Okay, well, here I am as a senior at Alter, about to be a senior as this photo was taken in the summer of 1966. Some things never change. I think Easterling Studios is still your photographer, according to some Alter publications I've looked at recently. You can see everything is legal here, no facial hair, the required coat and tie. We didn't have to wear coats in class, but we did have to wear a tie every day. But thankfully, Mr. Truxell, the late Mr. Truxell, who was the arbiter of style and decorum and such at Alter, I would say, he said it was okay for us to loosen our ties in class, particularly on hot days when he would do it. So Mr. Truxell earned his name on the driveway in front of your house, in front of your school, for that reason alone, I would say. But there were plenty of other reasons. I'll get to that later. Okay, I was Alter's first student at MIT. Not hard to do when you're in the second graduating class. MIT's mascot has always been the beaver, but it wasn't until the 1990s that they named it Tim the Beaver. So that's how I made this mirror image of one of their cartoons, MIT being Tim spelled backwards, and also mirror imaged. Um, on the 45th anniversary of our graduation from MIT, they solicited 2-minute videos from us. And I put that on YouTube, as you can see there, in 2016. Let's get a pointer up here. One of the themes of my years at MIT as an undergraduate was I was always studying physics, mathematics, and electrical engineering, and they all swirled about relating to one another. I always had assignments, and each of them, it seemed, always had interesting material to study. With the problem-solving approach that MIT was famous for, as well as other institutions like UC Berkeley with the chem study material and so on. So that seemed to be what I liked best about my studies there, and I wanted to put together some kind of a career that would relate to my favorite subjects and favorite approaches to science, mathematics, and engineering. Okay, here's a list of other milestones, as I would call it. I'm not going to list a bunch of awards and recognition and all that that comes with having a career. That's not of great interest to you students, but the National Science Foundation Fellowship that I got coming out of MIT for graduate study is something to keep in mind as the kind of thing you'd like to have if you're going to go on to, a PhD-driven type STEM career. Because you have federal money with a fellowship like this. So the colleges like you, they'll let you in if your tuition is going to be taken care of for 3 years. The professors like you, as long as you have the right background, you're taken care of as far as tuition support and living expenses and stipend and all that. So I would compare this to the athlete who appeals to a coach at a college with the concept of maybe he can help the coach, he or she can help the coach win the championship, right? If you can convince a coach of that, I'd say your college education is pretty well taken care of through that avenue. Well, that's a little harder to arrange as an undergraduate with academic achievement. You're not quite ready usually to help the professor publish new papers and so on, but it is the kind of thing to aspire to for graduate study. So I was also admitted to Caltech and University of Illinois, and why I didn't go is a long story, but I ended up at Cornell University, Ivy League school in Ithaca, New York, and completed a master's in solid state physics in 1973 there. And yet at all times I was continued my interest in electrical engineering as a way to implement solid state physics, if you will. So I actually ended up in the department of EE for my PhD by 1976. I even did a postdoc there for about 18 months or so. I called it playing professor because by then I had a research contract and I was teaching my thesis advisor's courses while he went on sabbatical that year, and finished up with a focus on high frequency semiconductor devices, microwave engineering, knowing semiconductor device phenomena and electronics and all that to a considerable extent. So this was a kind of blending of physics, mathematics, and EE that I had in mind. But at that point, having gotten the academic exercises off my back, including the professor type role, I thought it was time to go to industry, but industrial research, to keep my foot in the whole research idea. So I took a job in Palo Alto, California here at Varian Associates, a company you may not have heard of, but had some reputation there. And continued work on microwave devices, and then branched into solar cells and a contract for NASA that we did. And then the company itself did work on process equipment for the silicon chip making industry and all that. So I got involved in all those things, built up my background and experience for over 6 years, and then ended up at Intel in Santa Clara in 1984, and finished out my career there after 32 years. So at Intel, I worked on reliability, several assignments there, chip reliability, understanding the physics, understanding the technology, the process technology, and also the circuit design. It was mostly about protecting the chip pins against electrostatic discharge events. That activity was breaking out just as I joined them. I had the perfect background for it with the high frequency device work and design and so forth, testing, knowing the process, all that stuff. So yeah, utilized all those disciplines, particularly folding in the circuit design knowledge along with all this device physics and process technology understanding and so forth. That's a good combination to have when you have to chat up people in all different aspects of chip making. So that resulted in a bunch of patents and publications that I was able to do as well. And I've continued the research work really and the publication work since retirement with people I used to work with at Intel, or mostly working from home now, working on a computer and so on. So that's perfect for continuing one's professional activities. Well, one prominent trend in the semiconductor industry I noticed over the years was the computers we built got better and better, and we were able to use the computer more and more to anticipate what the silicon would look like. Now, in this cartoon, if you can read that caption, the slightly older boy at the computer is saying, now, this is just a simulation of what the blocks will look like once they're assembled. We do that in semiconductors too. More and more we use computers to anticipate all the physics and the design layout and the implications thereof. I learned to roll with that and chat up people who were more and more working on a computer, including myself. But my knowledge of the device and reliability physics and also the test engineering and the principles of design for reliability that I was able to use in design work and filing patents and so on. All those things were useful in building a career and rounding up resources within the company to achieve closure on what we call issues. And that term issues comes up a lot in the corporate world, believe me. So yeah, that's how technology evolves and how our industry evolved. That it's more and more about computer-aided design, and then sometimes the testing becomes an afterthought almost, but it can't be completely. These designs get more and more complicated, and you have to turn around the designs after testing. Well, okay, so fortunately, right as I started at Intel, I noticed a connection deep into my background back in the physics department at Cornell, actually, and came up with a method for characterizing circuits for their electrostatic discharge response. And that's what I became known in the industry for before too long when I published all this. It was a case of what everybody looks for, try to be in the right place at the right time. You can be in Silicon Valley, but have to wait 7 or 8 years before you really click on something that's going to allow your career to take off and move to the next level. So that became a publication, and there's a link to it if you're interested in looking at it. But yeah, it's relatively simple, all things considered. But making that connection was not as trivial as it might be considered now with the internet to look at everything available. You had to know things in those days, and making a connection with a technique that I had learned as a graduate student for a completely different reason was quite a thrill. Another contribution I made, this goes to 2011 now, just happened to appear on the cover of a magazine of the IEEE, that's Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers. This summer 2011 issue didn't come out till the fall, but it was coincident, it turned out, with another IEEE magazine that just happened to have David Bradley's IBM personal computer history article featured on the cover. So we were cover boys for about a month there, and had a nice little exchange of email over it. And Alternites were well represented that fall of 2011. Okay, my example from everyday life and computer usage is the following. It kind of surprised me a week or two ago to have this connection to my former career. I was just getting rid of an old Windows 7 PC that had been sitting around for 5 years. I want to make room for another old one pretty soon. So I took the back cover off and salvaged a few things from inside, like the hard drive and a CD-ROM drive, and also a 3-volt battery that I found myself staring at right around here. It's just a little smaller than a quarter, and I always find little home projects and funny things to do with small batteries. So I checked it to see if it still worked, and it still did work, even after sitting there for 5 years. Well, I know what it's used for. It's used for the real-time clock. Let's go to this next foil. The real-time clock makes sure that the PC doesn't forget the time and date when you pull the plug on the computer. So you need this more than any other computer with a desktop, because that has some off time. Laptop has a big fat battery that you use because it's mobile, and the backup 3-volt supply doesn't get much pressure. But if you have all the power off for 5 years, you depend on the fact that the circuitry for the real-time clock and its protection, which I designed, has very low leakage current, and that's just what we did, and we published about it, as you can see here. This is from or 2 publications, actually. This is from a journal article, and there was a patent filed as well. So suddenly my career from 15 to 20 years ago is coming back to me as I pulled the back off of a PC in hopes of being able to salvage a few things. So here we have the case of there are thousands of people that go into the design of that processor chip and computer, and they generate millions of units that go out the door into personal computers, which generate billions of dollars, and that's how we all pay the bills. Okay, a little change of focus here. If you're in research for long enough, and I was through graduate school and through a few years in industrial research, where we were aiming high, so to speak, you come up with the most prominent connections to the most prominent people in your field. So for me, that just happened to start at MIT, where a couple of fellows right next to me in my laboratory senior year, where I was in an atomic physics lab doing my undergraduate thesis. One of them was a first-year graduate student named Bill Phillips, and another one was a sophomore, 2 years my junior, who was starting some undergraduate research then, named Carl Wyman. Well, we didn't know it, but they were to get Nobel Prizes in physics later on in their careers, Bill in 1997 and Carl in 2001. They continued with atomic physics. I noticed that they were pretty bright and thought, no, maybe the basic research concept is pretty well covered. Maybe I should try to take some of those concepts into the industrial world in some way. So we all did what we thought best, and they did very well at it. And now Bill, among all these people I mentioned here, I guess I had the most overlap with. He arrived in the summer before my senior year when I was already working in Kleppner's lab. And so, you know, for a while there, we were in the lab all day, every day, and eating lunch in a group. And I got a good exposure to his thought process, and that influenced my own. I found myself in future years asking, you know, what would Bill do here? And pretty soon that became what I would do. Another guy at MIT that he hasn't gotten a Nobel Prize yet, but he's distinguished himself in the cosmology world by introducing inflation theory. Now, you may have seen that discussed in TV programs about cosmology and the Big Bang and the early universe and so on. That's Alan Guth, who was a junior lab instructor for me and also ran a small section of the required senior research seminar where we talk about our senior thesis projects and so on. Yeah, he was quite a sharp guy, another basic research guy that I thought would do well in the future, and he did. Robert Laughlin is a neighbor of mine at Stanford University now, but he was at MIT at one time, not overlapping with me, but we overlapped with the same MIT professor there, Professor Wolf, who taught solid state physics in my senior year, and I was influenced to continue with solid state physics because of interactions with him. Yeah, I did meet Robert Laughlin in a completely bizarre incident one time. It's too detailed to go into. At Cornell, there was, well, the renowned Hans Bethe, who was born in the first decade of the last century and famous for his work at Los Alamos during World War II, and honored in 1967 for his work going back to the 1930s on processes in stars and all kinds of things related to the early development of quantum mechanics, really. There was a group down the hall from me doing helium-3 superfluidity, Richardson, Lee, and Osheroff, who were honored in 1996, who had their breakthrough experiment that happened right after I arrived at Cornell, and we all heard about it at that point. So they were down the hall, but I felt close to them. Meanwhile, yes, I did take Hans Bethe's advanced quantum mechanics course as a graduate student. Herb Kromer, recognized in 2000 for work he was well known to have done in 1957 on the heterojunction semiconductor. He was at conferences all the time when I was a double E graduate student, and I met him there. And you know, one reason why I chose Varian among my possibilities for a research job after graduation was he had been a manager there and was still consulting at Varian when I started in 1977. So he was well respected, and I shared an office with one of his former graduate students from the 1970s who had just gotten out. So yeah, he was quite a presence in certain device research going on at that time. And finally, I'd say I had a brush with the 2014 Nobel Prize in Physics that was awarded to those Japanese scientists that achieved the breakthrough, the long hoped for breakthrough in blue LEDs, light emitting diodes, made out of gallium nitride. Now, up to that time, starting back in the 60s, we had red LEDs and then green, and those were pioneered by Hewlett Packard, actually. There was even a time in 1983, before I went to Intel, that I could have taken a job with Japan's Nippon Electric Company in New Jersey, starting up a lab there, where this would be one of the things on the charter for 3,5 compound and similar light emitting diodes. But I also had a couple of colleagues at Varian who were on the very same technology, organometallic vapor phase epitaxy, this stands for. And they were hired, they had done some of that at Berrien. They were hired at Hewlett Packard 3 blocks away to do more of it. Almost surely gallium nitride LEDs are in their charter. So, that was the right place at the right time, because the breakthrough in Japan occurred, in the mid 1980s among these Nakamura and 2 other guys at Nagoya University, who were in my age bracket. And it was Nakamura who found the real hook in chemical catalyst while working for a chemical company in Japan, and he had connections to Nagoya University. And I myself visited Nagoya University as part of my Japanese studies back in the 70s, Japanese studies that extended into the 1990s. That too is a long story. I won't go into it, but there was some overlap with my career there, but not as much as there might have been. So, I'm sure my former colleagues that went to Hewlett Packard feel like they narrowly missed the gallium nitride light emitting diode. It has to be blue along with the green and red so that you can get white. I think, that has probably been part of your physics training so far. But yeah, we didn't have white light emitting diodes without the blue one, and that didn't happen until the mid to late 1980s in a commercially manufacturable way. Okay, other reflections. Well, I transitioned from physics to electrical engineering, you might notice, without giving up on research, including aiming high, and a few things that might have blossomed into something really good. So I gave it a shot, and don't feel too bad about not having reached the Nobel Prize level. But at the same time, I found it convenient to, be in Silicon Valley and be on the cusp of these commercial developments that are important too. So my first 6 years of continued skill development were, kind of aimed toward both of those things. Another advantage to working for a public corporation is that in the case of the 2 corporations that I worked for, Berrien and Intel, they allowed employees to buy their stock at a discount, invest in it, and they were also companies that knew what they were doing, and the stock did well. That's a whole other story. And at Intel, there were even stock options for employees, even at my level. So that all worked out a little better than working for the government. And as long as there are interesting things to do, things of a scientific nature that appeal to you, then someone like me can do a corporate job as well. Just to change the focus for a moment or so, one of my observations is that if you're a techie, try to have some kind of a hook into the arts, whatever it may be. Now, we can't all be like Scott Adams with his Dilbert cartoons that were a nice supplement to his corporate job and allowed him to leave that one early. But in my case, I worked it into my job by being, as I say, that engineer who can write, and was therefore popular with the patent attorneys as far as having them read my patent disclosures and say, hey, I'd like to file one on this. Although, it's the decision is made as a group effort, but the patent attorneys did like working with me, and I dare say I have a few extra patents filed because of the way I can write up the patent disclosure. So choose something in the arts that distinguishes you and try to fold it into your job in a meaningful way. Now, coming back to that idea of a 40-year career window in technology, once again, we recognize that my window is fading into history, and then yours is coming into view with a very different technological landscape. But the study of history is meaningful, and I myself look more and more at my own grandfather's technology window, which goes back to the beginning of the last century. Now, he was born in 1874 in Cincinnati, just a few years after his father came over from Germany. And he was a self-taught chemist. He was, this is my mother's side, the German side of my family. And He started a small chemical factory in Salina, Ohio, Mercer County, and his best-selling product was lubricant for New England textile mills for the wooden looms that were used to spin wool. And why did he do this Silicon Valley-like thing of building his own small factory? Well, it's because he worked in a factory just like it, a stearic acid factory, as it was called, a factory in Syracuse, New York, that burned down. So that's a very good reason to start your own company. You like your own job back, and the factory burned down, and it's not going to be rebuilt unless you go build another one somewhere. So that's a very good reason to be an entrepreneur. I get a little bit put off by the appeal of entrepreneurship itself among some entrepreneurs and would-be entrepreneurs who kind of back into the whole thing because they like the trappings of entrepreneurship. The visualization of a job and a useful product that you probably already know how to sell, that's hard to beat. So this factory started to fade out in the 1950s with this replacement of scale of chemical engineering is a lot bigger now, and starting back then. But that was enough for him to raise 9 kids, including my mother. It was 7 girls and 2 boys, and it seems that the technology interest skipped a generation and is maybe best expressed in me and among the grandchildren. The grandchildren have done pretty well in other ways, but I'm the technology guy, it seems. And he invested in the rest of America to make sure that his kids and grandkids would be taken care of a little bit, but it wasn't enough that we didn't have to work or anything. We're not running foundations or any of that. So the fade out was graceful enough that when he died in 1959 at 85, it was appropriate for his factory to go out of business and be sold for scrap. The factory was on an acre or two of ground, and employed a few family members and not more than like 10 hourly workers. So it was not a large factory, but it prospered and put his kids through college, which is something to say when you have 9 kids. So, okay, coming back to the 40-year window, I'd like to point out that to choose something to do in technology or whatever you end up doing, eventually it'll be seen that your birth year is important. But we don't know why yet. I didn't know why early on. I just knew I would probably be influenced by historical forces, and I was. Now, after about 20 years of working with each other from different companies on industry committees and conferences and so on, there were 3 of us in my semiconductor electrostatic discharge field that discovered that the 3 of us were born within 2 months of one another back in 1949, even the summer of 1949. What does that mean? Well, historical forces brought us together, and the 1984 connection was in common also, pretty much. A lot of people have noticed that Bill Gates of Microsoft and Steve Jobs of Apple were both born in 1955. Well, why was that? Well, largely because the personal computer became possible in the early 70s when microprocessor chips came out. Microprocessor chips from the likes of Intel. So these guys at college age seized on that, while the rest of us were in graduate school and aiming for jobs a little bit different. But good for them. And on the non-technical aspect, a lot of commentators have noticed that 3 American presidents were born in mid-1946. I think you all know who those are, including the present one. But what does that mean? Nobody can seem to figure out what, but it's an interesting fact. Well, in summary, I would say that a good technical job is one where you can regularly advance the thought process and be known for doing so. That certainly appeared on a lot of performance reviews in my case, and I think some, happy, successful people manage to make that part of their career. Now, the thought process scientifically for you is probably on an individual basis for now, but the thought process applies to a lot of things. Nonetheless, well, as I'm thinking of it, some of you youngsters may be pretty much in charge of keeping the family computers going, and that process has to be worked out, sometimes interacting with other members of your family. And so that must be an interesting thing to do, because you're more, you all relate to each other in a certain way when you talk about computer maintenance and repair functions and what have you. I'm a little too old to have gone through all that with the family, but that certainly must be interesting. And that kind of leads into the next topic here. I guess when I read about community service activities going on at Alter through the Alter publications that I get, I say, well, that's different from what we did 50 years ago. 50 years ago, the school was new, the suburban environment was kind of new, and the transportation thing was just being worked out. And we had cars, but not as many cars, and the cars broke down. And also we had large post-war families. I was related to 25 or 30 people around town, and I found myself doing a lot of family service. We didn't have the community service events organized in later years by Mr. Truxell, I understand. But I guess I got my spirit of community service through family service in high school, where parents seemed to make good use of a teenage boy with a driver's license as far as helping relatives around town. And we had, handicapped child, we had kids who were orphaned at 14, things like that. So, yeah, try to get the right spirit from the community service events that you participate in, and realize that eventually you can even apply your technical skills to things that affect the community, and that community also, I do want to say, can and should include your employer. Now, employers of STEM workers include universities, governments, corporations, and I put kind of a high priority on having the employer be a good community of people who cooperate with one another. That's not always the case for various reasons in various environments. They have other priorities, like staying alive or, doing their job for whoever the client might be. But it is a community, and there are opportunities for the same good feeling you get from community service when you help people in your corporation. I could give examples from the semiconductor industry, but again, those are all out of date. We do things a little differently now. It wouldn't be that useful, but you can find community right there where you work, as well as in the larger community. Okay, well, the publications I talked about, and a few other things biographical about me and so on, are at my website listed here, and I have an email there for any other contact. It might be appropriate to do a question and answer session live sometime. We can certainly do that through Zoom. So let's go back to the camera here and get that out of the way. Whoops. Hello. I think it's time for me to sign off and send this recording out. Thank you very much. Bye.